Hello, sixth graders. I am recording a video of the next selection in your reading textbook, which is entitled Last Summer with Maizon. It's the second to last passage that you have to read. And if you would open your book and follow along, I'm not going to be able to hold it up and show it the whole time because I'm going to be reading it out loud. So just get your book and open up to page 274 and follow with me. I know sometimes it's hard to stay focused, and so this is just something that you can use if you're having a hard time following and reading it all by yourself. You can tune in and follow along with me as I'm reading it to you and for you. On page 274, it just gives you a little bit of introduction, life in the city. So that's a clue to help you realize that this is probably going to be about some characters who live in the city. And it says, what is life like in a city neighborhood? And again, we're on page 274, so make sure your book is open there. In Last Summer with Maizon, a girl recalls good times with a friend who has moved away from their Brooklyn neighborhood. So there's a specific clue that the city is Brooklyn. Does anybody know what state that's in? New York. You're right. Brooklyn, New York. Okay, so the picture there is of a family, it looks like, or some friends and a dog, and there's an arrow pointing up, and it says, in the summer, people in the city can spend time together on a stoop or a small porch of their apartment building. Here, neighbors may express their friendship by talking, joking, and telling stories. Now, we know we're a little limited with that right now because of being, forced to do some social distancing, but we can still communicate with each other here online on the internet and through messaging. So make sure you're staying connected with your friends in the ways that you can. All right, on the next page, 275, there's another caption here. It says, right here is what I'm looking at, pointing down. Because summer days in the city can be very hot, playing in a fountain is a cool way to relieve the heat. So that's another clue that indicates that this is probably taking place in the summer and it's going to be hot. In the New York City subway, these friends are daydreaming about the things they might do at day camp. And then it also says here, read on to discover how two best friends value their previous summer months together in the neighborhood. On page 276, there's some information about the author Jacqueline Woodson and the illustrator Eric Velasquez. So you can read that. I'm not going to read that out loud. Page 277 is the cover of the book. So if you were to go to the library and check this whole book out, this is what the cover would look like. Although with most of these selections in your reading book, we're just reading parts of the book. Okay. The strategy focus says, life won't be the same for Margaret now that her best friend Maizon is going away. As you read, evaluate how well the author shows that Margaret misses Maizon. So again, lots of clues here about what the story is going to be about. And that there's going to be some, having to say goodbye to a friend. And so gives us definitely a reason to read. Now we have some ideas about what's going to be happening here. All right, if you notice the print at the top of page 278 is red. And that's kind of a little snippet or introduction of what was happening in the book up to this point. And now it's going to put you into the book at that point. So I'm going to read that part. Margaret Torrey and her best friend Maizon do everything together. They even live on the same block in Brooklyn, New York. But the summer they turn 11, things change. Margaret's father passes away, and Maizon is offered a scholarship to a boarding school in Connecticut. Now Margaret has to cope with her friend going away. Okay, so now we're kind of jumping into the story at this point. And the picture shows two girls sitting in what looks like a subway. So it looks like they're traveling from one place to another. In a big city, a subway is used. You might go to school in a subway, or you might go to your friend's house in the subway, or you might go down to the store or something like that. We don't have a subway in Covington because we're a small town, but we have buses we use to ride to school. So it might be kind of the same as sitting on a bus and talking to your friend. Sure wish you weren't going away, Margaret said, choking back tears for what seemed like the millionth time. They were sitting on the M train crossing the Williamsburg Bridge, and Margaret shivered as the train passed over the water. The L train would have made the trip easier, but the L didn't go over the bridge, and Maizon had wanted to ride over it once more before she left. Maison sat nervously, drumming her fingers against the window pane. Me too, she said absently. Margaret looked over at Mama and Grandma. Grandma stared out of her window. She looked old and out of place on the train. Maison, Margaret said, turning back toward her. Hmm, it's kind of a question mark. Maison frowned. She seemed to be concentrating on something in the water. It rippled and danced below them. Even though I wrote you those 2 letters, you only have to write me one back if you don't have a lot of time or something. Margaret looked down at her fingers. She had begun biting the cuticles, and now the skin surrounding her nails was red and ragged. I'll write you back, Maison promised. Maison. What, Margaret? Margaret jumped and looked at Maison. There was an uneasiness in her eyes she had never seen before. Forget it, she said. Miss Torrey leaned over. We'll be getting off in a few stops. They rode the rest of the way in silence. At Delancey Street, they changed for another train, and half-hour later they were at Penn Station. I guess now we'll have to call each other to plan the same outfits, Maison said as they waited for her train. Her voice sounded forced and fake, Margaret thought, like a growing up trying to make a I messed that up. Like a grown up trying to make a kid smile. I feel like a lot of you all can relate to this because right now, we have to plan things kind of across the distance, to do things together. So you guys could plan to dress alike, even though you're not at school today, you could plan with a friend to dress alike. And, you're not going to see each other except maybe through pictures or online, but, you could still kind of keep that relationship going, just like Margaret and Maison are going to have to do. I guess, Margaret said. The conductor called Maison's train. I guess I gotta go, Maison said softly, and Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. I'll write you back, Margaret. Promise. Thanks for letting me keep the Double Dutch trophy, even if it is only second place. They hugged for a long time. Maison sniffed loudly. I'm scared, Margaret, she whispered. Margaret didn't know what to say. Don't be. Bye, Miss Torrey. Margaret's mother bent down and hugged Maison. Be good, she said, as Maison and her grandmother made their way toward the train. Mama, Margaret said as they watched Maison and her grandmother disappear into the tunnel. What, dear? What's the difference between a best friend and an old friend? I guess, her mother thought for a moment. I guess an old friend is a friend you once had, and a best friend is a friend that you'll always have. Then maybe me and Maison aren't best friends anymore. Don't be silly, Margaret. What else would you be? Some people can barely tell you apart. I feel like I've lost a daughter. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe we're old friends now. Maybe this was our last summer as best friends. I feel like something's going to change now, and I'm not going to be able to change it back. Miss Torrey's heels made a clicking sound through the terminal. She stopped to buy tokens and turned to Margaret. Like when Daddy died? She asked, looking worried. Margaret swallowed. No, I just feel empty instead of sad, Mama, she said. Her mother squeezed her hand as they waited for the train. When it came, they took their seats by the window. So we just learned something else about Margaret and the fact that her father has died. And so that's another aspect of her characterization that we're learning. Her character is being developed for us here by the author. Miss Torrey held on to Margaret's hand. Sometimes it just takes a while for the pain of loss to set in. I feel like sometimes Maison kept me from doing things, but now she's not here. Now I don't have any. Margaret thought for a moment, but couldn't find the right words. Now I don't have any excuse not to do things. When the train emerged from its tunnel, the late afternoon sun had turned bright orange. Margaret watched it for a moment. She looked at her hands again and discovered a cuticle she had missed. Margaret pressed her... Oh, almost missed some things here. So if you look at the very top, we're on page 281 at the top. Notice this, this is kind of a new feature on the page. It's a text feature to pay attention to. And a lot of times, we've said, well, there's a break in the page or there's some kind of symbol. I think in Where the Red Fern Grows, it was like a little leaf design. So I think it's indicating to us that time has elapsed, that there's some time in between ending at the bottom of page 280 and starting at the top of page 281. So keep that in mind as you read. Margaret pressed her pencil to her lips and stared out the classroom window. The schoolyard was desolate and gray. But everything seemed that way since Maison left, especially since a whole week had passed now without even a letter from her. Margaret sighed and chewed her eraser. Margaret, are you working on this assignment? Margaret jumped and turned toward Miss Peasel. Maison had been right. Miss Peasel was the crabbiest teacher in the school. Crabbiest is an interesting word. I think it kind of means grumpy or cranky or, you know, mean maybe. Margaret wondered why she had been picked to teach the smartest class. If students were so smart, she thought, the least the school could do was reward them with a nice teacher. I'm trying to think about what to write, Miss Peasel. Well, you won't find an essay on your summer vacation outside that window, I'm sure. Or is that where you spent it? The class snickered, and Margaret looked down, embarrassed. No, ma'am. I'm glad to hear that, Miss Peasel continued, looking at Margaret over grainy glasses. And I'm sure in the next 10 minutes you'll be able to read your essay to the class and prove to us all that you weren't just daydreaming. Am I right? Uh-oh, Margaret might be in trouble. I hope so, ma'am, Margaret mumbled. She looked around the room. It seemed everyone in 6-1 knew each other from the previous year. On the first day, a lot of kids asked her about Maison, but after that, no one said much to her. Things had changed since Maison left. Without her, a lot of the fun had gone out of sitting on the stoop with Miss Dell, Hattie, and little Jay. Maybe she could write about that. No, Margaret thought, looking down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. It was too much to tell. She'd never get finished, and Miss Peasel would scold her, making her feel too dumb to be in 6-1. Margaret chewed her eraser and stared out the window again. There had to be something she could write about quickly. Anybody have any thoughts? Margaret Torrey, Miss Peasel warned, am I going to have to change your seat? Ma'am, I think I'm going to have to move you away from that window unless you can prove to me that you can sit there without being distracted. I can, Miss Peasel. It helps me write. Then I take it you should be ready to read your essay in, Miss Peasel looked at her watch, the next 7 minutes. Top of 283. Margaret started writing frantically when Miss Peasel called her to the front of the room. Her sheet of notebook paper shook in her hand. She pulled nervously at the hem of the maroon dress she and Maison had picked out for school and tried not to look out at the 26 pairs of eyes she knew were on her. Last summer was the worst summer of my life. First, my father died. Then, my best friend went away to a private boarding school. I didn't go anywhere except Manhattan. But that wasn't any fun because I was taking Maison to the train. I hope next summer is a lot better. Wow, so that reveals a lot about what's going on inside of Margaret's head. I think Miss Peasel might back off a little bit or at least leave her alone maybe a little bit more. We'll see. I'd like to see you after class, Margaret. Yes, ma'am, Margaret said softly. This is the end, she thought. 1 week in the smartest class, and it's over. Maison was smart enough to go to a better school, and I can't even keep up in this class. Margaret sighed and tried not to stare out the window for the rest of the day. When the 3 o'clock bell rang, she waited uneasily in her seat while Miss Peasel led the rest of the class out to the schoolyard. Margaret heard the excited screams and laughter as everyone poured outside. The empty classroom was quiet. She looked around at the tables. Many had words carved into them. They reminded her of the names she and Maison had carved into the tar last summer. They were faded and ill-eligible now. Ill-eligible is a good vocabulary word. Ill is a prefix, and elige, I'm sure, it's probably the root. I'd have to do a little research. And then able is the suffix, so not able to be read. Not able to be read. Now it's faded. Miss Peasel came in and sat at the desk next to Margaret's. Margaret, she said slowly, pausing for a moment to remove her glasses and rub her eyes tiredly. I'm sorry to hear about your father. That's okay, Margaret fidgeted. No, Margaret, it's not okay, Miss Peasel continued. Not if it's going to affect your schoolwork. I can do better, Miss Peasel. I really can. Margaret looked up pleadingly. She was surprised at herself for wanting so badly to stay in Miss Peasel's class. I know you can, Margaret. That's why I'm going to ask you to do this for homework tonight. Margaret started to say that none of the other students had been assigned homework. She decided not to, though. I want you to write about your summer, Miss Peasel continued. I wanted to express all your feelings about your friend Maizon going away. Or it could be about your father's death and how you felt then. It doesn't matter what you write, a poem, an essay, a short story, just so long as it expresses how you felt this summer. Is that understood? Seems like she's being punished here, but maybe Miss Peasel has another um, motive here. Yes, ma'am. Margaret looked up at Miss Peasel. It's understood. Miss Peasel smiled. Without her glasses, Margaret thought she wasn't that mean looking. Good. Then I'll see you bright and early tomorrow with something wonderful to read to the class. Margaret slid out of the chair and walked toward the door. That's a very pretty dress, Margaret, Miss Peasel said. Margaret turned and started to tell her that Maison was wearing the same one in Connecticut, but changed her mind. What did Miss Peasel know about best friends who were almost cousins anyway? Thanks, ma'am, she said instead, and ducked out of the classroom. All of a sudden, she had a wonderful idea. So there's a couple ways to look at this. One is Miss Peasel punishing her because she's been daydreaming? Or I'm kind of thinking that Miss Peasel has another motive, that she kind of wants Margaret to work out some of these feelings and emotions by writing. So that's kind of a strategy, possibly. And again, there's another line with this sort of block in the middle to indicate that time has elapsed. So maybe it's the next day. There's a clue. Another clue. It says the next morning. The next morning, Miss Peasel tapped her ruler against the desk to quiet the class. Margaret, she asked when the room was silent, do you have something you want to share with us today? Margaret nodded, and Miss Peasel beckoned her to the front of the room. This, Margaret said, handing Miss Peasel the sheet of loose-leaf paper. It had taken her most of the evening to finish the assignment. Miss Peasel looked it over and handed it back to her. We're ready to listen, she said, smiling. Margaret looked out over the class and felt her stomach slide up to her throat. She swallowed and counted to 10. Though the day was cool, she found herself sweating. Margaret couldn't remember when she had been this afraid. My pen doesn't write anymore, she began reading. I can't hear, someone called out. So you can imagine somebody in the back of the room saying, I can't hear. My pen doesn't write anymore, Margaret repeated. In the back of the room, someone exaggerated a sigh. The class chuckled. Margaret ignored them and continued to read. Now, the next page looks totally different than the other pages. Notice that. So this looks more like a what? We studied this. This is a poem. So it looks like that's what Margaret chose to write, was a poem. And this is what she's reading to the class. And she's already said, my pen doesn't write anymore. And she goes on to say, top of 285, it stumbles and trembles in my hand. If my dad were here, he would understand. Best of all, it'd be last summer again. But they've turned off the fire hydrants, locked green leaves away, sprinkled ashes on you, and sent you on your way. I wouldn't mind the early autumn if you came home today. I'd tell you how much I miss you and know I'd be okay. Mama isn't laughing now. She works hard and she cries. She wonders when true laughter will relieve her of her sighs. And even when she's smiling, her eyes don't smile along. Her face is growing older. She doesn't seem as strong. I worry because I love her. Miss Dell says, where there is love, there is a way. It's funny how we never know exactly how our life will go. It's funny how a dream can fade with the break of day. I'm not sure where you are now, though I see you in my dreams. Miss Dell says the things we see are not always as they seem. So often I'm uncertain if you have found a new home, and when I am uncertain, I usually write a poem. Time can't erase the memory, and time can't bring you home. Last summer was a part of me, and now a part is gone. Wow, that's a beautiful poem. The class stared at her blankly, silent. Margaret lowered her head and made her way back to her seat. Could you leave that assignment on my desk, Margaret? Miss Peasel asked. There was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Yes, ma'am, Margaret said. Why didn't anyone say anything? I wonder why they didn't say anything. Maybe they felt bad for laughing or or they feel sad now for Margaret because they found out about her dad and her best friend and everything. Now, if everyone will open their history books to page 275, we'll continue with our lesson on the Civil War. Margaret wondered what she had expected the class to do. Applaud? She missed Maizon more than she had in a long time. She would know what I'm feeling, Margaret thought, and if she didn't, she'd make believe she did. Margaret snuck a look out the window. The day looked cold and still. She'd tell me it's only a feeling poets get and that Nicky Giovanni feels this way all of the time. When she turned back, there was a small piece of paper on her desk. And Nicky Giovanni is a very well-known poet that I think we talked about in February. We talked about Nicky Giovanni. I liked your poem, Margaret, the note read. There was no name. Margaret looked around, but no one looked as though they had slipped a note on her desk. She smiled to herself and tucked the piece of paper into her notebook. The final bell rang. As the class rushed out, Margaret was bumped against Miss Peasel's desk. Did you get my note? Miss Peasel whispered. Margaret nodded and floated home. So it was Miss Peasel that gave her the note. Miss Dell, Hattie, and Lil Jay were sitting on the stoop when they got home. If it weren't so cold, she said, squeezing in beside Hattie's spreading hips, it would be like old times. Except for Maizon, Hattie said, cutting her eyes toward her mother. Hush, Hattie, Miss Dell said. She shivered and pulled Lil Jay closer to her. For a moment, Margaret thought she looked old. It's just this cold spell we're having, Miss Dell said. Ages a person. Makes them look older than they are. Margaret smiled. Reading minds is worse than eavesdropping, Miss Dell. Try being her daughter for 19 years, Hattie said. Hattie, Margaret said, moving closer to her for warmth, how come you never liked Maizon? No one said I never liked her. No one had to, Miss Dell butted in. She was just too much ahead of everyone. At least she thought she was. But she was, Hattie. She was the smartest person at PS 102. PS stands for public school. Remember, if you've ever read Wonder, the schools are named PS, and they have a number in New York because there's so many schools. You know, we just have Covington schools, so it's just Jeter Watson Intermediate and Edgemont Primary School. But if we had a lot of different schools throughout the whole city, if it was a big city, they might be numbered PS and with a number like that. Imagine being the smartest person. But she didn't have any common sense, Margaret. And when God gives a person that much brain, he's bound to leave out something else. Like what? Miss Dell leaned over Lil Jay's head and whispered loudly. Like the truth. She and Hattie laughed, but Margaret couldn't see the humor. It wasn't like either of them to say something wrong about a person. She told the truth, Margaret said weakly. Miss Dell and Hattie exchanged looks. How was school? Hattie asked too brightly. Boring, Margaret said. She would tuck what they said away until she could figure it out. That's the only word. Boring. Okay. Sorry. She would tuck, let's look at that for just a minute. She would tuck what they said away until she could figure it out. So I don't think Margaret has completely understood what Hattie and Miss Dell are saying about Maizon. And, you know, she doesn't really have time to process it right now. So she's just going to figure it out later. That's the only word you know since Maizon left. Seems there's got to be something else going on that's not so boring all the time, Miss Dell said. Well, it's sure not school. I read a poem to that stupid class, and no one but Miss Peasel liked it. She sighed and rested her chin on her hand. That's the chance you got to take with poetry, Miss Dell said. Either everybody likes it or everybody hates it, but you hardly ever know because nobody says a word. Too afraid to offend you or, worse yet, make you feel good. Margaret looked from Miss Dell to Hattie, then back to Miss Dell again. How come you know so much about poetry? You're not the first little black girl who wanted to be a poet, and you can bet your dress that you won't be the last, Hattie concluded. You wanted to be a poet, Hattie? Still do. Still make up poems in my head. Never write them down, though. The paper just yellows and clutters useful places. So this is where I keep it all now, she said, pointing to her head. A poem can't exist inside your head. You forget it, Margaret said doubtfully. Poems don't exist, Miss Know-it-all. Poems live. In your head is where a poem is born, isn't it? Margaret nodded, and Hattie continued, well, my poetry chooses to live there. Page 288. Then recite one for me, please. Margaret folded her arms across her chest the way she had seen Miss Dell do many times. Some poems aren't meant to be heard, Smarty Pants. Oh, Hattie, Miss Dell interrupted. Let Margaret be the judge of that. All right, all right. Hattie's voice dropped to a whisper. Brooklyn bound Robin Redbreast followed me from down home. Brooklyn bound Robin, you're a long way from your own, so fly among the pigeons and circle the sky with your song. They were quiet. Miss Dell rocked little Jay to sleep in her arms. Hattie looked somberly over the block in silence, and Margaret thought of how much Hattie's poem made her think of Maizon. What was she doing now that the sun was almost down, she wondered. Had she found a new best friend? Maybe, she said after a long time. Maybe it wasn't that the class didn't like my poem. Maybe it was like your poem, Hattie. You just have to sit quietly and think about all the things it makes you think about after you hear it. You have to let it sink in. You have to feel it, Margaret, Hattie said softly, draping her arm over Margaret's shoulder. Yeah, just like I felt when I wrote my poem, or you felt when you found a place for that one in your head. Margaret, Miss Dell said, you getting too smart for us old ladies. Margaret leaned against Hattie and listened to the fading sounds of construction. Soon the building on Palmetto Street would be finished. She closed her eyes and visions of last summer came into her head. She saw herself running down Madison Street, arm in arm with Maizon. They were laughing. Then the picture faded into a new one. She and Maizon were sitting by the tree, watching little Jay take his first steps. He stumbled and fell into Maizon's arms. Now it all seemed like such a long time ago. Page 290. When she opened her eyes again, the moon was inching out from behind a cloud. It was barely visible in the late afternoon. The sky had turned a wintry blue, and the streetlights flickered on. Margaret yawned, her head heavy all of a sudden from the long day. What's it mean when your head gets heavy all of a sudden from a long day? It means that you are tired or sleepy. Just a little bit more. We have to read over to the bottom of 291, and that'll be the end of the story. Looks like your mother's working late again. Bless that woman's heart. Seems she's working nonstop since your daddy passed. She's taken drawing classes. She wants to be an architect. Maybe she'll make a lot of money. Architects don't make a lot of money, Hattie said. And anyway, you shouldn't be worrying your head over money. She has a gift, Miss Dell said. All of you Tories have gifts. You with your writing, your mama with her drawings, and remember the things your daddy did with wood. Oh, that man was something else. What's little Jay's going to be? Miss Dell stood up and pressed little Jay's face to her cheek. Time's going to tell us, Margaret. Now, come inside and do your homework while I fix you something to eat. No use sitting out in the cold. Margaret rose and followed them inside. You hear anything from Maizon yet? Hattie asked. Margaret shook her head. If only Maizon were running up the block. I wrote her 2 letters, and she hasn't written me one. Maybe she knows we're not really best friends anymore, Margaret sighed. She had been right in thinking she and Maizon were only old friends now, not the friends they used to be. Still, I wish I knew how she was doing, she said, turning away so Hattie wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. We all do, honey, Hattie said, taking Margaret's hand. We all do. And remember, that's the end of this part of the book. So in your book, page 292 is the next one. This is where you have some questions. You're going to be choosing 3 or 4 questions. Look at your assignment sheet, and then you've got some workbook pages to go along with it. But this book is one that you could check out from the library. Last Summer with Maizon is an entire book instead of just the part of the book that you have in your literature book. So I encourage you to try to find that. I know our public library, if you have your library card, you can check out ebooks. And I put a link on our Google Classroom for Epic, and so there are some books there. I'm not sure if that one's in there. I'd have to go through and look, but keep reading, keep working on your assignments, and it will pay off. I'm proud of all of you for working, and those of you who are tuning into these, let me know if you have questions. Send me messages on Google Classroom, and I will see you soon.